Oh.
because it offers some really practical strategies for creating a classroom that is just buzzing with thought.
It really is a problem, right? I mean,
Right.
traditional math teaching often has everyone marching in lockstep. This chapter argues that a thinking classroom needs something different, a way to differentiate instruction, even when students need to move at their own speed.
I think the authors lay out the problem really well by saying, and this is a quote, "Mathematics teaching, since the inception of public education, has largely been built on the idea of synchronous activity."
Mm.
And then they offer a potential solution through the concept of flow.
Mm.
So have you ever gotten so lost in a task that time just seems to disappear, that feeling of total absorption?
That's a task.
Like flow.
And what's fascinating is that when we're in a state of flow, we're primed for deep learning. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who really kind of studied this phenomenon, found that flow happens when there's a perfect balance between the challenge of a task and our ability to meet it. So think about rock climbers or chess players,
Mm.
completely immersed in what they're doing. That's the kind of engagement we want to create in our classrooms.
So how do we create that flow state for all of our students, especially when they're all at different levels? That's where the chapter strategies of extensions and hints come in. It's like building this customized learning path for each student.
Exactly. Extensions are essentially increasingly challenging tasks that keep nudging students just beyond their comfort zone. It's got that feeling of accomplishment you get when you finally conquer a tough problem. The book gives a great example, using a sequence of tasks about factoring quadratics. And it starts simple, maybe expanding a basic expression like the quantity x plus 2 times the quantity x plus 3. And then each subsequent task ramps up the complexity, keeping students on their toes.
I picture it like a video game. You know how each level gets a little harder, but because you've mastered the previous level, you're ready for the challenge. But what about when a student or a group of students gets stuck? That's where hints come into play, right?
Absolutely. The chapter breaks down hints into 2 types, those that decrease the challenge and those that increase the student's ability. A hint that decreases challenge might be offering a reminder of a key concept, while a hint that increases ability might be suggesting a new strategy or connecting it to something they already know.
I see how that distinction is important. You're not giving away the answer,
Yep.
but rather empowering them to find it themselves. But timing is everything, isn't it? When is the right moment to offer a hint? The book seems to emphasize that. Keeping students in flow is easier when they're working in groups.
That's a really crucial point. Group work allows for a constant exchange of ideas and feedback, so students are less likely to get stuck for long periods of time. They can bounce ideas off each other, offer support, and celebrate successes together. It creates this dynamic learning environment where everyone feels supported and challenged.
So it's like each group has its own mini support system,
Mm-hmm.
helping each other stay in flow.
Mm-hmm.
But even with carefully designed extensions and well-timed hints, there will be times when a group hits a wall. The book talks about shifting modes of engagement as a way to re-energize those moments.
Yeah.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, imagine a group is wrestling with a problem and getting nowhere instead of jumping in with a hint. You might ask them to justify their thinking so far, even if their answer is wrong. Explaining their process can help them spot their own misstep, and often that's enough to get them back on track.
So it's like encouraging that metacognitive process, thinking about their own thinking. So justifying is one mode of engagement. What are the others?
The next step up is explaining, where students actually teach the concept to each other. This forces them to really solidify their understanding and often reveals gaps they didn't even realize they had. And finally, the most challenging mode is creating, where students design their own problems or extensions.
It's like a staircase of increasingly sophisticated thinking. But I'm wondering how we can make sure every student is engaged in these modes, even within a group setting. After all, individuals learn at different paces.
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do we make sure every student is stretched and challenged, even within a group where abilities might differ? It's not about forcing everyone to be at the exact same point, but rather about creating an environment where each individual can thrive.
So how do we achieve that delicate balance?
Yeah.
The book uses the example of providing feedback. And it's not just coming from the teacher anymore.
Precisely. Think about it. In a thinking classroom, students are getting feedback from the task itself. Does their solution work? They're getting it from their peers. Do their explanations make sense? And of course, there's the teacher's guidance. Ideally, these all work together to create a rich feedback loop.
But what if a student is lagging behind within their group? Wouldn't it slow everyone down to constantly cater to the one who's struggling.
That's where the idea of giving the marker comes in. The book suggests that sometimes. The best way to help a struggling student is to actually give them more responsibility. Make them the designated explainer, the one who has to walk the group through the solution.
That's counterintuitive. I would think you'd want to lessen the pressure on someone who's already having trouble.
It seems that way, yeah. But think about it. When a student is struggling, they often start to disengage. Giving them the marker forces them to actively participate, to wrestle with the concepts, and to articulate their thinking. It brings them back into the heart of the learning process.
It's like saying, hey, we need your voice in this conversation. Your understanding is important.
Exactly. And more often than not, that student quickly catches up. Once they've had that opportunity to solidify their understanding, they can contribute more effectively to the group's progress. It's about creating a culture of shared responsibility for learning.
This really highlights the power of student collaboration. But I'm also curious about when individual work might be more beneficial. There are times when solitary thinking is needed, right?
Absolutely. The authors aren't advocating for group work all the time. There are definitely moments when students need that quiet space to process information on their own, to wrestle with ideas independently, and to develop their own understanding before sharing it with others.
So how do we strike that balance? How do we know when to encourage collaboration versus independent work?
It all comes down to knowing your students and the specific demands of the task. If a task requires deep individual focus, or if you sense students need time to digest information on their own, individual work might be the better choice. It's about being intentional and flexible, adapting your approach to meet the needs of the moment.
I'm noticing a theme here. Flexibility, observation, and a deep trust in the learning process seem to be at the heart of building a thinking classroom.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's not about rigidly following a script, but rather about creating a dynamic environment where students feel safe to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from each other. And that requires us as teachers to be constantly observing, adjusting, and responding to what we see happening in our classrooms.
We've talked about extensions and hints as crucial tools, but this idea of thin slicing also stood out to me. Can you explain what that means in the context of building a thinking classroom?
Think about trying to cut a thick cucumber with a dull knife. It's going to be messy and frustrating, right? But if you slice it thinly, it becomes much easier and more manageable. That's the essence of thin slicing in math.
For some, we're taking those potentially overwhelming tasks and breaking them down into smaller, more digestible pieces.
Exactly. Instead of presenting students with a complex problem that might induce panic, we carefully scaffold the learning. We create a sequence of tasks, each building on the previous one, gradually increasing the complexity.
I can see how this would help prevent those moments of I'm lost and keep students feeling confident and engaged. The book gives some great examples of thin slicing sequences, right?
Yes. They highlight a sequence for teaching two-step equations in middle school. It starts with a fun number guessing game. The teacher gives clues like, if I add 3 to my number and then double it, the answer is 12. Students have to work backward to figure out the original number.
I love those kinds of puzzles. They get everyone thinking and reasoning without feeling like a formal math lesson.
Exactly. And after a few rounds of this game, the teacher seamlessly introduces the formal notation of two-step equations. Because students have already grasped the underlying concepts through the game, the transition to symbolic representation is smooth and intuitive.
It's like sneaking in the learning through play. But I imagine creating these sequences from scratch could feel daunting for teachers.
That's a valid concern. But the beauty is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The book emphasizes that even familiar tasks from your existing curriculum can be adapted into these kinds of sequences. It's about looking at your materials with a fresh perspective and thinking, how can I break this down into smaller, more manageable steps?
So it's less about finding completely new material and more about strategically structuring what we already have. The chapter also mentions that teachers don't have to do this alone, right?
Absolutely. The authors encourage collaboration among teachers, sharing ideas, brainstorming sequences, and supporting each other can make this process much more manageable and enjoyable. It's about building a community of practice where everyone benefits from collective wisdom and experience.
That makes a lot of sense. We've talked about extensions, hints, thin slicing. It's clear that keeping students in flow requires a whole toolkit of strategies. But there's another fascinating concept in this chapter that I'd love to explore. The idea of stealing tasks. Can you tell us more about that?
It's not as nefarious as it sounds, remember. The goal is to keep everyone engaged at a level that's just right for them. So, if a group is cruising through their tasks, getting bored, they can look around the room and see what other groups are tackling. If they spot something that seems more challenging, they can ask the teacher if they can steal it and work on that instead.
I love that. It promotes a sense of agency and allows students to take ownership of their learning. It also creates this dynamic learning environment
Yeah.
where everyone is constantly observing and learning from each other.
It's about fostering a culture of healthy competition and intellectual curiosity, where students are excited to challenge themselves
Yeah.
and push their boundaries. It also frees up the teacher to focus on those who might need extra support or guidance.
It seems like in a thinking classroom, the teacher's role shifts dramatically.
Yes, it becomes less about delivering direct instruction and more about facilitating and guiding. The teacher is still the architect of the learning experience, designing the tasks and setting the stage. But then it becomes about empowering students to take the reins,
Yeah.
to explore, to struggle, to discover, and to ultimately own their learning journey.
It sounds like a beautiful dance
Yeah.
between teacher guidance and student agency. This has been such an enlightening conversation. I'm feeling inspired and ready to apply these ideas in my own classroom.
Me too. I think this chapter offers such valuable insights into how we can move away from that traditional model of everyone working at the same pace and embrace the beautiful messiness of a thinking classroom.
But before we wrap up, I think we need to circle back to that question of how to differentiate instruction for individual students within a group. It's something that often keeps teachers up at night. How do we ensure every student is getting what they need, even within a collaborative setting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the heart of it, isn't it? We've talked about all these wonderful strategies for creating a thinking classroom, but how do we make sure no one gets lost in the shuffle? Especially when students are working in groups. It's a constant juggling act, and honestly, one of the biggest challenges teachers face. But this chapter offers some reassurance, remember. In a thinking classroom, feedback is coming from multiple sources. The task itself provides feedback, group members provide feedback, and of course the teacher is observing and offering guidance.
But how do we tailor that feedback to individuals within a group? Let's say one student is grasping the concept quickly, while another is struggling. How do we meet both of their needs simultaneously?
That's where knowing your students and being adaptable comes in for the student who's racing ahead. You might offer an extension, a more challenging problem that builds on the current concept, or you might encourage them to shift into that explaining mode, teaching the concept to their group mates.
I love that. It not only keeps them engaged, but also deepens their understanding through the act of explaining. But what about the student who's lagging behind? It seems counterintuitive to give them even more responsibility in that moment.
It might seem that way, but the book suggests something really interesting. Give the marker to the student who's falling behind. Make them the designated explainer, the one who has to lead the group through the solution process.
I'm starting to see the logic here. It's not about singling them out or putting them on the spot. It's about forcing them to actively engage with the material rather than passively observing.
Exactly. When we're forced to articulate something to explain it to others, we have to confront our own understanding.
Right.
Often in that process of explaining, the student will realize where their thinking went off track or solidify a concept that was shaky before.
It's like that saying, the best way to learn something is to teach it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And think about the message it sends to that student. You're saying, your understanding matters. Your voice is important in this group. It can be incredibly empowering.
This whole conversation has really highlighted the delicate dance between teacher guidance and student autonomy in a thinking classroom. It's about creating a space where students feel safe to struggle, to make mistakes, and to learn from each other.
And that's where our role as teachers becomes even more crucial. We're not just delivering information, we're creating the conditions for deep thinking to occur. We're the architects of the learning experience, carefully designing tasks, providing well-timed hints and extensions, and orchestrating the flow of the classroom.
It's about constantly observing, assessing, adjusting, and responding to the ever-changing needs of our students. It's a demanding role, but also an incredibly rewarding one.
Absolutely. There's nothing quite like seeing the light bulb go on when a student finally grasps a concept they've been wrestling with, or witnessing the collaborative energy of a group working together to solve a challenging problem.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about, so many practical strategies to try in my own classroom. It feels like a roadmap for moving away from that traditional model of passive learning and embracing the dynamic energy of a thinking classroom.
I hope our listeners are feeling that same sense of excitement and possibility. Remember, building a thinking classroom isn't about achieving perfection overnight. It's a journey, a process of continuous learning and growth for both our students and for us as educators.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another exploration of how to create classrooms that truly spark a love of learning. So we keep coming back to this question of how to make sure no one gets lost, right?
Yeah, it's
There's
a
never a
constant balancing act.
Mhm.
But the chapter offers some reassurance by reminding us that in a thinking classroom, feedback comes from many different places. The task itself provides feedback, group members provide feedback, and of course the teacher is there observing and offering guidance.
But how do we tailor that feedback to each student within a group?
Yeah.
Like, let's say one student is really getting it and another is struggling. How do we meet both of their needs at the same time?
Well, that's where knowing your students and being adaptable is really important. For the student who's racing ahead, you might offer them an extension, like a more challenging problem that builds on what they're already working on. Or you might encourage them to become the explainer. Have them teach the concept to their group.
Okay, I like that. So not only are they staying engaged, but they're also deepening their understanding by explaining it. But what about the student who's behind? It seems kind of counterintuitive to give them more responsibility when they're already having trouble.
I know, right? It seems like the opposite of what you'd want to do. But the book suggests that.
Hmm.
Sometimes the best way to help a struggling student is to give them the marker. Make them the one who has to explain
Mm.
and walk the group through the
I
solution.
see. So it's not about putting them on the spot. It's about making sure they're really engaging with the material.
Exactly. When you have to explain something out loud to somebody, you have to really think about it. And a lot of times just by doing that, a student will realize where they went wrong or suddenly understand something that was confusing before.
Right? It's like that old saying, the best way to learn something is to teach it.
Exactly. And think about it from the student's perspective. You're basically saying, hey, what you think is important, we need to hear from you.
And that can be a really powerful message.
Right.
This whole conversation has really highlighted how important it is to find the right balance between what the teacher's doing
Yeah.
and what the students are doing. It's about creating a space where it's okay to struggle,
Yeah.
to make mistakes,
Yeah.
and to learn from each other.
That's exactly what a thinking classroom is all about. And that's where we as teachers come in. We're not just teaching content. We are creating the environment where thinking can happen. We're designing the tasks, giving hints and extensions, and making sure everything is flowing smoothly.
So we're constantly watching
All right.
and adjusting
Yeah.
and responding to what our students need.
Yeah, and it's a lot of work, but it's so rewarding. There's nothing like seeing that light bulb moment when a student finally gets it, or seeing a group work together to solve a problem.
Well, I know I have a lot to think about after this deep dive. It's given me a lot of ideas for my own classroom.
Yeah, me too.
Hmm.
This chapter was packed with information, and I think the most important thing to remember is building a thinking classroom. It's not something that happens overnight. It takes time, and it's always evolving.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time with more about creating classrooms that spark a love of learning.